The story of modern Israel and Palestine is long and complex. It begins long before 1948 with deep historical and religious connections to the land for both Jews and Arabs. For centuries, the area was part of the Ottoman Empire, and later under British control after World War I. During this time, a movement called Zionism grew. It called for a national home for Jewish people in their ancestral land. Many Jews began moving there, buying land and building communities. This created tension with the Palestinian Arabs who already lived there and who also saw the land as their home. Both groups had strong feelings of nationalism and a desire to govern themselves. After the horrors of the Holocaust in World War II, international support for a Jewish state grew stronger. The United Nations stepped in to find a solution. In 1947, the UN proposed a plan to divide the land, which was then called British Mandate Palestine, into two separate states, one for Jews and one for Arabs. The city of Jerusalem was to be a special international city, governed by neither side alone. The Jewish leadership accepted this plan, seeing it as a historic opportunity to establish their own country. However, Palestinian leaders and neighboring Arab nations rejected it completely. They felt the plan was unfair and gave too much land to the Jewish population. This disagreement set the stage for a major conflict. On May 14, 1948, as the British prepared to leave, Jewish leaders in Tel Aviv declared the creation of the State of Israel. It was a moment of great joy and triumph for many Jews around the world, a safe haven after centuries of persecution. But for Palestinians, it was the beginning of what they call the Nakba, or the catastrophe. They saw it as the loss of their homeland. The very next day, armies from 5 neighboring Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded the new country, determined to destroy it and support the Palestinian cause. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War was fierce and had lasting consequences for everyone involved. The new Israeli army, though outnumbered, fought with determination and managed to win. When the fighting ended in 1949, Israel controlled more land than the UN plan had originally given it, including West Jerusalem. Jordan took control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while Egypt took control of a small strip of land called the Gaza Strip. The war created a massive refugee crisis. More than 700,000 Palestinians fled or were forced from their homes in the areas that became Israel. They and their descendants now number in the millions, many still living in refugee camps, waiting for a resolution that has never come. For nearly 2 decades after the 1948 war, an uneasy quiet settled over the region, but tensions remained extremely high. The Arab nations still refused to recognize Israel's existence, and smaller-scale attacks continued along the borders. Israel focused on building its new state and absorbing hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants from around the world. Meanwhile, Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and neighboring countries held on to the hope of returning to their homes. The situation was like a powder keg, waiting for a spark. That spark came in June 1967 when Israel launched a surprise attack against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, believing they were preparing to invade. This conflict became known as the Six-Day War, and its outcome dramatically changed the map of the Middle East. In just 6 days of fighting, Israel achieved a stunning military victory. It captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. For many Israelis, this was a miracle. Capturing East Jerusalem with its ancient holy sites like the Western Wall was a deeply emotional moment. But for Palestinians in the Arab world, it was another devastating defeat. Suddenly, more than 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza were living under Israeli military occupation. Another major war broke out in 1973. On Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack to try to reclaim the lands they had lost in 1967. The Yom Kippur War was incredibly costly for both sides, with thousands of soldiers killed in just a few weeks of intense fighting. Israel was caught off guard at first, but was able to push back the invading armies. Though Israel ultimately won the war militarily, the initial success of the Arab armies restored a sense of pride and showed that Israel was not invincible. This difficult war made some leaders on both sides realize that military conflict might not be the only way forward. These wars had a profound psychological impact. For Israelis, the constant threat of attack created a deep-seated need for security. Controlling the territories captured in 1967 was seen by many as essential for creating a buffer zone against future invasions. For Palestinians living under occupation, life became a daily struggle with military checkpoints, restrictions on movement, and the loss of land to Israeli settlements. These settlements, built on land captured in 1967, are considered illegal under international law, but successive Israeli governments have continued to support them. This steady expansion made the idea of a future Palestinian state seem less and less possible, fueling anger and despair. By the early 1990s, after decades of conflict, a new feeling began to emerge. Some leaders on both sides were tired of the endless cycle of violence. The world was changing, the Cold War was over, and there was a sense that it was time to try a different approach. This led to a series of secret meetings between Israeli and Palestinian negotiators in Oslo, Norway. These talks were a major breakthrough. For the first time, leaders were talking directly to each other, trying to find a way to share the land peacefully. The goal was to create a plan for Palestinian self-government in the West Bank and Gaza, with the promise of a final peace treaty in the future. The high point of this effort came in 1993. On the White House lawn, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestine Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat shook hands. It was a powerful symbol of hope for the entire world. The agreement they signed, known as the Oslo Accords, created the Palestinian Authority. This new body was given limited control over parts of the West Bank and Gaza. The plan was for a 5-year period where more and more control would be handed over, leading to a permanent solution for the most difficult issues: the final borders, the status of Jerusalem, the fate of Israeli settlements, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. However, the hope of the Oslo Accords quickly began to fade. The process was very difficult and faced strong opposition from extremists on both sides. Palestinian groups like Hamas launched suicide bombings in Israeli cities, trying to destroy the peace process. On the Israeli side, a right-wing extremist who opposed giving up land assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. This was a terrible blow to the peace movement. His death removed a key leader who was willing to take risks for peace. The trust that had been carefully built began to fall apart, and both sides accused the other of not following through on their promises. The final attempt to reach a permanent agreement failed in 2000 at a summit at Camp David in the United States. The leaders could not agree on the core issues, especially the future of Jerusalem and the refugee question. The collapse of the talks led to a new wave of violence known as the Second Intifada, or Palestinian Uprising. This period was much deadlier than the First Intifada of the late 1980s, with thousands of Israelis and Palestinians killed over several years. The failure of the Oslo process left both peoples feeling betrayed and more divided than ever. The optimism of the 1990s was replaced by deep pessimism and a return to conflict. The Gaza Strip has become one of the most volatile and tragic centers of the conflict. It is a very small, incredibly crowded piece of land, home to over 2 million Palestinians, many of them refugees from the 1948 war. In 2005, Israel made a major decision to withdraw all of its soldiers and settlers from Gaza. Many hoped this would reduce friction and be a step toward peace. However, what happened next made the situation even more complicated. In 2007, the militant group Hamas, which opposes Israel's existence and the Oslo Accords, violently took control of Gaza from the more moderate Palestinian Authority. In response to the Hamas takeover, Israel and Egypt imposed a strict blockade on Gaza, controlling what goods and people could go in and out. They argued this was necessary for security to stop weapons from reaching Hamas, but the blockade has had a devastating effect on the people of Gaza. The economy collapsed, unemployment soared, and access to clean water, electricity, and medical care became severely limited. The United Nations has repeatedly called it a humanitarian crisis. For Palestinians in Gaza, life became a struggle for survival, feeling trapped in what many call an open-air prison, with little hope for the future. This tense situation has led to repeated cycles of brutal violence. Hamas and other militant groups have fired thousands of rockets into Israeli towns and cities, causing fear and trauma for civilians living nearby. In response, Israel has launched major military operations in Gaza, using its powerful air force and army to target Hamas infrastructure. These operations have resulted in widespread destruction and the deaths of thousands of Palestinians, including many civilians and children. Each round of fighting leaves both sides with more anger and grief, making a peaceful resolution seem even more distant and impossible to achieve. The conflict reached a new and horrific level in late 2023. On October 7th, Hamas fighters broke through the border from Gaza and launched a shocking attack on southern Israel, killing around 1,200 people, mostly civilians, and taking more than 240 hostages. It was the deadliest attack in Israel's history. Israel declared war on Hamas and began a massive and sustained military campaign in Gaza. The resulting war in 2023 and 2024 has caused unprecedented destruction and a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, with tens of thousands of Palestinians killed and much of the population displaced. The conflict has trapped both peoples in a state of fear and suffering, with no easy answers in sight.